Cancel the entire $4 billion deal with the Langstons. Right now. Those were the exact words spoken by a black woman standing in the middle of the Four Seasons ballroom in Beverly Hills, her white gown soaked in red wine, her skin glistening under the golden chandeliers, her eyes colder than winter steel. The entire room froze. Just moments earlier, she had been on the floor, pushed, humiliated, laughed at, recorded on dozens of smartphones. To them, she was just another outsider who'd wandered into a place she didn't belong. But now, those same people were holding their breath, their laughter silenced by 5 simple words that would cost them everything. Let me take you back. Her name is Celeste Warren. And while most of the guests at that charity gala saw a woman they assumed was part of the catering team, they had no idea they were mocking one of the most powerful CEOs in America. A self-made billionaire who had clawed her way from poverty in Atlanta to running one of the largest private equity firms in the country. Her company, Warren Equities, controls assets in technology, clean energy, commercial real estate, and finance, worth over $68 billion. But none of that mattered to the Langston family and their circle of elite friends. They didn't see her power. They didn't see her legacy. They saw her skin. And they thought they were safe. What they didn't know was that the woman they had just shoved onto the marble floor, the one they laughed at for wearing a dress more expensive than their mortgages, was the reason they hadn't already lost everything. Because that night was supposed to be the beginning of a historic partnership. A $4 billion deal that would save their collapsing empire. Instead, it became the beginning of their end. And now, I want you to ask yourself one question. What would you do if you were her? Because what she did next didn't just shock the room. It made history. Celeste Warren was not born with wealth. She was not born with connections, or the safety net of a family name etched in marble. What she had was grit. Raw, unfiltered, stubborn grit. Raised by her grandmother in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Atlanta, Celeste learned early what the world expected of her, and what she refused to accept. Her grandmother, Miss Lila, worked 2 jobs and still found time to teach Celeste everything that really mattered. How to walk with your back straight. How to speak with purpose. And how to never, ever let someone else define your worth. By the time she was 10, Celeste could quote stock prices and explain compound interest better than most adults. At 13, she had already read through her local library's entire business section. She applied to Stanford at 17, got in on a full scholarship, and never looked back. But it wasn't just talent that made her rise. It was pain. It was rejection. It was being told time and time again, "You're not what we're looking for." And every time someone said that, Celeste didn't break. She built. After graduating, she worked for 3 years at a firm that saw her as nothing more than a diversity statistic. She smiled, she learned, and then she left. With $10,000 in savings, 1 laptop, and an idea that wouldn't let her sleep, Celeste launched Warren Equities from her tiny apartment kitchen. 20 years later, she owns skyscrapers in New York, solar farms in Arizona, logistics networks in Texas, and tech startups across Silicon Valley. She has been featured on Forbes, Time, and the Wall Street Journal. But none of those headlines matter to her nearly as much as one simple truth. She never forgot where she came from. Celeste still sends money to rebuild schools in her old neighborhood. She funds scholarships for Black and brown students who remind her of herself. She mentors young founders who would otherwise never get a seat at the table. She doesn't just believe in opportunity, she creates it. That's who they tried to humiliate. That's who they laughed at. And that's why what came next wasn't just personal. It was necessary. On the outside, the Langston family looked like American royalty. They were old money. Legacy money. The kind of wealth that came with oil portraits, private jets, and board seats handed down like heirlooms. For decades, Langston Capital was one of the most respected private equity firms on the West Coast, with headquarters in downtown San Francisco and satellite offices in New York and London. Gregory Langston, the patriarch, wore tailored suits and shook hands with senators. At 63, he had inherited his father's firm and had spent his adult life projecting power. In interviews, he spoke about innovation and economic growth. In reality, He was running on fumes. Behind the closed doors of Langston Capital, the picture was very different. The firm was hemorrhaging cash. Gregory had made a series of risky investments that didn't pay off, real estate plays that crashed, tech partnerships that flopped, and overseas ventures that never even got off the ground. To keep appearances, he'd borrowed against everything: his assets, his reputation, even his own home. But no one knew. Not his employees, not his wife, not even the board of directors. To the world, Gregory Langston was still the king of capital. But he knew the truth. Without a miracle, Langston Capital wouldn't survive another year. His wife, Clara Langston, was even more devoted to the illusion. Clara had built an entire identity around social superiority. She hosted charity galas, appeared in luxury magazines, and judged everyone by the shoes they wore and the champagne they drank. She didn't care how the money was made, only that it looked good while being spent. Their children had grown up inside that bubble. Brody Langston, their 31-year-old son, was a walking scandal with a trust fund. He spent his days chasing women and his nights avoiding headlines. He had no job, no ambition, and no accountability. And worst of all, he thought cruelty was charm. Lydia Langston, 27, was more refined, more calculated. But she was equally dangerous. As a social media influencer with 500,000 followers, she knew how to destroy someone's reputation with a single post, and she enjoyed it. This was the family on the verge of collapse. But instead of facing the storm with humility, they chose to host a gala. A desperate, glittering distraction. And at the center of it was a deal they couldn't afford to lose. A $4 billion lifeline, handed to them by the very woman they would try to humiliate. The Four Seasons in Beverly Hills was dressed like a dream. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above velvet-lined walls. A string quartet played softly near the entrance. White-gloved servers moved like clockwork between the tables, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and flutes of Dom Perignon. Every corner of the ballroom was curated to perfection, at least on the surface. But beneath the elegance was panic. The Langstons needed this night to be flawless. It wasn't just a charity gala, it was their last shot at survival. For Gregory, this was the night he would finally announce a strategic partnership that would save Langston Capital from collapse. The $4 billion merger with Warren Equities was supposed to be the headline. A bold move. A symbol that the Langstons were still on top. The irony, of course, was that the woman holding their future had already arrived. Celeste Warren stepped through the hotel's lobby just after 7 p.m., dressed in a floor-length white gown with silver accents that sparkled under the marble lighting. Her presence was striking, commanding, elegant, unmistakably powerful. But no one in the ballroom recognized her. And that was their first mistake. Gregory had never met Celeste in person. All the negotiations had been handled through lawyers and executives. He had no idea what she looked like, no interest in the details. He had assumed, like many men in his circle, that someone at her level would be older, likely male, and definitely white. So when Celeste arrived alone, without fanfare or a name tag, no one saw a billionaire in the room. They saw a woman who didn't fit their expectations. Clara was busy directing the photographers. Brody was already 3 drinks in. Lydia was live streaming the event to her followers. None of them knew that the person they were about to publicly humiliate was the very reason they still had a roof over their heads. The gala itself was designed as a performance. Speeches, champagne toasts, flashes of camera lights, and carefully rehearsed smiles. But what no one realized was that they were also being watched. Not by investors, or donors, or the press. They were being watched by the woman who had already decided whether they would rise, or fall. And while they posed for pictures, Celeste stood in the shadows, graceful, composed, and quietly noting everything. Because that night, the stage was theirs. But the power was hers. Celeste arrived at the Four Seasons with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was, and what she came to do. But the moment she stepped out of her black SUV and approached the main entrance, the atmosphere shifted. Not in the music. Not in the lighting. But in the eyes of the people meant to welcome her. The The valet barely glanced at her before directing her, without a word, toward the back entrance reserved for service staff. He did it casually, like it was the natural order of things. A gesture so practiced it almost looked automatic. Celeste paused. "I'm here for the Langston Foundation Gala," she said, her voice calm but firm. The valet blinked, then gave a stiff nod and pointed her toward the front again, without apology, without acknowledgement. That was the first hint. At the ballroom entrance, a tall security guard named Joel stood with a clipboard and a smile that quickly vanished when he saw her. He had just waved in 3 white couples in designer gowns without so much as checking their names. But when Celeste stepped forward with her personalized invitation, Joel's tone changed. "I'm gonna need to see your ID," he said, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, as if trying to match her to some internal profile that clearly didn't fit. Celeste handed him both the invitation and her driver's license. Joel studied both like he was examining a counterfeit. He tilted her license under the light, squinted at the photo, flipped the invitation over, twice. "You here alone?" he asked. Celeste nodded. He hesitated, glanced toward the guest list again, and slowly checked off her name. "You can go in," he muttered, not bothering to meet her eyes. As Celeste walked past him, she watched a blonde woman behind her breeze through with just a wave and a smile. No ID. No clipboard. Inside the lobby, a group of socialites whispered as Celeste passed. One of them narrowed her eyes, leaned into another, and whispered, "Staff shouldn't be walking through the front." They didn't know who she was. They didn't care. To them, she was just another face that didn't belong. Celeste didn't flinch. She'd seen this kind of thing her whole life. Smiles for some, suspicion for others. But tonight, she would remember every word, every glance, every wall they tried to place between her and the future they desperately needed. The ballroom shimmered under golden light, laughter echoing off polished marble floors. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. It was a performance of wealth and power, and everyone was playing their part. Celeste stood near the bar, still unnoticed, sipping a glass of sparkling water. She had been in the room less than 10 minutes, long enough to recognize faces from business magazines and society columns. None of them recognized her. None of them thought to. She wasn't wearing a name tag. She didn't arrive with an entourage. She simply existed, and for people like the Langstons, that was already too much. Lydia Langston, in a red satin gown and heels that clicked with authority, had been circling the room like a queen without a crown. When she spotted Celeste standing alone, her eyes narrowed. She whispered something to her brother Brody, who smirked and nodded. Moments later, Lydia approached with a full glass of red wine in one hand and a look of fake sympathy on her face. "You must be parched," she said, smiling sweetly. "Let me get you something." Before Celeste could respond, Lydia extended the glass as if offering it, then swiftly turned her heel and clipped the edge of Celeste's foot with her pointed toe. The move was subtle, calculated, but the result was brutal. Celeste stumbled forward, and in a split second, the glass of wine tipped, spilling across her white gown like a crimson wound. She hit the marble floor hard, her palms slapping against the cold stone, the room gasping before it erupted in laughter. Brody howled from across the bar, lifting his phone to capture the moment. "Looks like we've got a clumsy guest crashing the party," he shouted. Clara Langston rushed over with a hand on her hip, her voice cutting through the air. "This is exactly why staff should use the service entrance," she snapped. "Security." Celeste sat there for a moment, red wine soaking into her gown, the crowd around her buzzing like a hive. Phones were pointed at her. Whispers flew like daggers. Some laughed. Others simply watched. She looked up, and for the first time that night, her eyes met Lydia's. Cold. Unapologetic. Proud. But something else was beginning to rise. Not rage. Not shame. Power. And for the first time in that room, someone should have felt afraid. The laughter had not even died down when Celeste began to rise. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if every motion carried its own weight. Her hands brushed off her gown, stained deep burgundy now, the silk clinging to her like battle-worn armor. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she stood tall, shoulders back, chin up, unshaken. People expected her to run, to cry, to lash out. Instead, she reached into her clutch and pulled out a phone. A slim black device, unremarkable to most, but what she did with it would leave the room frozen. She dialed with precision. 1 ring. 2. Then a voice answered on the other end, crisp, efficient, professional. "This is Helena from Warren Equities," the voice said. Celeste's tone didn't shake. It didn't rise. It didn't waver. "Helena," she said evenly. "Cancel everything related to the Langston deal. Effective immediately." There was a pause. "All of it?" Helena asked, her voice catching the gravity. "Every last dollar. The investment package. The real estate fund. The credit facilities. The partnership announcement. Shut it down." Guests nearby, still smiling moments earlier, were starting to glance over, catching fragments of the conversation. Brody stopped laughing. Lydia lowered her phone. Clara, oblivious, barked again. "Can someone get her out of here?" Celeste turned ever so slightly, not to address her, but to let the words hang in the air. "Do you want a public statement drafted?" Helena asked. Celeste's eyes scanned the room, pausing on the faces that had just delighted in her pain. "Yes," she replied. "And make sure the press release includes why." "Understood." Celeste ended the call. That was it. No shouting. No threats. Just a few quiet words and a business decision that would ripple through every corner of the Langston empire. Gregory Langston hadn't even realized what was happening. He was too far across the room, locked in conversation with donors and pretending everything was under control. But within minutes, control would be the last thing he had. Because the woman they thought was beneath them had just taken the floor, and the fortune with her. And the storm she summoned would be swift. The silence that followed Celeste's phone call was deafening. Not because the music stopped, it hadn't. Not because the lights dimmed, they stayed bright and warm. But because the room, once filled with smug laughter and champagne-soaked arrogance, had suddenly run out of air. People didn't quite understand what had just happened, but they felt it. Something shifted. The temperature changed. And then, slowly, the truth began to surface. Celeste turned and began walking through the ballroom. Not rushing. Not hiding. She walked like she had every right to be there, because she did. Lydia's eyes followed her. Brody stared, his phone lowered. Even Clara, now sensing the unease, was beginning to wonder. Celeste stopped near the center of the room. She reached into her purse once more and pulled out a small, polished metal card. Platinum. Minimalist. Timeless. She held it out to a nearby guest, who glanced down at the engraved name, and visibly paled. "Celeste Warren," the guest whispered. Those 2 words spread like a wildfire through the crowd. One person gasped. Another clutched their phone tighter. Then someone, finally, connected the dots. "That's Warren." As in Warren Equities. Heads turned. Gregory Langston, mid-conversation, froze. He had heard the name, felt the weight in the air. He slowly stepped toward the center of the room, confusion in his eyes, until he saw her. "Miss. I'm sorry, I don't think we've." Celeste turned to him calmly. Her voice carried without effort. "We haven't. But you've certainly been negotiating with me for the past 6 months." Gregory's face lost color. "I'm Celeste Warren, founder and CEO of Warren Equities." You could hear it. That collective intake of breath. The way reality cracked and slid into place. She continued. "The building you're standing in, this hotel floor, is owned by one of my holding companies. The wine you spilled on my dress, imported from one of my vineyards in Napa. The sponsors behind your gala? 3 of them are subsidiaries of mine." Gregory staggered back a step. And Clara. Her voice faltered. No. That can't be true. Celeste looked at her. Not with anger, but with absolute certainty. You didn't have to know who I was to show me respect. But now that you do. She paused. Consider this your receipt. And with that, every person in that room finally understood. This was not their event anymore. It never had been. The destruction began not with a bang, but with a briefcase. One of Celeste's attorneys, a sharply dressed woman with silver hair and a demeanor like granite, walked through the ballroom doors carrying a black leather case. No fanfare. No announcement. Just calm, deliberate motion. She was followed by two more lawyers, equally poised, equally silent. They moved with a sense of purpose that cut through the tension like a blade. The chatter faded. People stepped back. The champagne stopped flowing. For the first time all night, the room became still. The lead attorney opened her briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and began to speak. By order of Warren Equities, and under the authority granted by the board, all pending contracts, letters of intent, and preliminary agreements with Langston Capital are hereby terminated. Effective immediately. Gregory Langston's face went ghost white. The $4 billion equity deal, she continued, has been voided. The commercial real estate projects under review, terminated. The renewable energy fund, withdrawn. And all financial facilities extended to Langston Capital, recalled. The words fell like stone. You can't do this, Gregory muttered, stepping forward, his voice breaking. We've already announced the partnership. The attorney barely blinked. No contracts have been signed. No funds transferred. Your press statements were premature. And per Clause 4A, Warren Equities reserves full right to withdraw without notice prior to formal execution. Clara stumbled back, grabbing Gregory's arm. Brody stood frozen near the bar, staring at the floor like it might swallow him. Lydia tried to speak, but her voice cracked under the weight of what she now understood. They had destroyed the one alliance that could have saved them. Celeste said nothing. She simply watched. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The room did the work for her. Phones rang. Emails pinged. Executives pulled up financial apps. Investors whispered. Donors vanished into the crowd. The Langston name, once gilded with prestige, was melting in real time. One guest leaned into another and asked quietly, "Are we witnessing the death of a dynasty?" The other nodded. "No. We're witnessing the consequences of one." And at the center of it all, standing taller than ever, was Celeste Warren, flawless in composure, unshakable in power, and completely in control. This wasn't revenge. It was reckoning. It started with a single video. 30 seconds of footage. Grainy, shaky, shot by a guest too eager to capture what they thought was harmless party drama. The clip showed Celeste falling. The red wine splashing. Laughter. The way Clara Langston barked at security like she was ordering takeout. The way Brody lifted his phone, laughing. Lydia's smirk in the background. All of it. Within minutes, the video was posted to social media. Within hours, it went viral. At first, the comments were mixed. Some users didn't know who Celeste was. But as more clips surfaced, different angles, clearer audio, one even catching Celeste's full name being announced, the narrative shifted. Fast. People began stitching the video together with her Forbes covers, her TED Talk, her profile in the Wall Street Journal. The same woman who had been laughed at on the floor was now being celebrated across the internet as a symbol of quiet strength and unapologetic power. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag respect costs nothing. Hashtag Warren not wealthy. Hashtag Langston exposed. By morning, it had hit every major news network. Black CEO cancels $4 billion deal after racial humiliation at charity gala. It was no longer just a social scandal. It was a corporate disaster. A legal nightmare. A public relations crisis with no playbook. PR firms refused to work with the Langstons. Brands pulled their sponsorships. Donors began issuing statements, distancing themselves from the family they had once proudly partnered with. Even longtime allies fell silent. Nobody wanted to be associated with what the Langstons had become. Sponsors who had committed seven-figure donations for the event suddenly claimed clerical errors. Influencers who had once called Lydia their style icon quietly unfollowed her. A country club Clara had belonged to for 2 decades sent her a formal notice suspending her membership, citing ethics violations under review. But the harshest blow came from the business world itself. Board members resigned. Credit lines were pulled. Real estate partners withdrew overnight. The SEC launched an investigation into Langston Capital's financial reporting, prompted by anonymous tips that suddenly poured in. In less than 24 hours, the family went from elite to exile. And through it all, Celeste didn't need to say another word. She had already spoken. Not with her voice, but with her values. And the world was listening. When a name falls, it doesn't fall in silence. It collapses with weight. With whispers. With headlines. And in the Langston family's case, with no mercy. For Gregory Langston, the fall was brutal and public. Within days, he was forced to resign from the company his father had built. Langston Capital filed for emergency restructuring. His personal assets were frozen as the SEC launched a full investigation into years of hidden debt and questionable offshore transfers. Suddenly, the man who once negotiated deals on private jets was giving depositions in borrowed suits. His once loyal board of directors? Gone. His reputation as a financial genius? Shattered. And the press? They renamed him overnight, from mogul to cautionary tale. Clara Langston, once the queen of California's high society, found herself exiled from the world she worshipped. The gala circuit dried up. Invitations disappeared. Her face, once photographed at fundraisers and fashion events, was now the symbol of elitist arrogance. Even her oldest friends stopped answering calls. The women who once begged for her endorsement now denied ever knowing her. Her favorite designer boutiques quietly removed her name from client lists. The staff that once ran her estate quit without notice. And worst of all, she could no longer pretend. There was no charity left to hide behind. Lydia Langston faced her own reckoning. Her influencer brand collapsed almost overnight. Sponsors pulled their collaborations. Followers unfollowed in waves. Screenshots of her mocking Celeste mid-fall were posted with captions like, "This aged like milk." She tried to apologize, but the internet wasn't buying it. Her carefully curated life of filters and brand deals was replaced with silence. Every partnership gone. Every platform tarnished. She became a case study in how fast fame turns to infamy. And Brody, he never saw it coming. The video of him laughing, filming, calling Celeste clumsy, it haunted him. It was reposted by thousands, turned into reaction videos, dissected by corporate ethics panels. Companies blacklisted him. His trust fund, already stretched thin by lawsuits and bad investments, was frozen to cover pending settlements. He lost the apartment, the sports car, the parties, and his so-called friends. They were never really friends to begin with. They disappeared the moment the bottle service stopped. In less than a week, the Langstons lost their money. But what they really lost was something deeper. Respect. And once that's gone, no amount of money can buy it back. In the end, it was never about the money. Not really. Yes, Celeste Warren canceled a $4 billion deal. Yes, she brought an empire to its knees with a single phone call. But what truly shook the world wasn't the financial collapse, it was the moral clarity. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't need to yell, threaten, or demand attention. She simply held up a mirror. And the Langstons didn't like what they saw. This story isn't just about business. It's about how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us. When we believe they're powerless. When we assume we're above them. Because the truth is, kindness costs nothing. But cruelty can cost you everything. What happened to the Langston family could have been avoided at every single turn. At the valet stand, at the entrance, in the ballroom. All they had to do was treat another human being with basic decency. They didn't have to know her name. They didn't need to understand her background. All they had to do was choose respect over ego. But they didn't. And that's the difference between a name that builds legacy and one that becomes a warning. Celeste Warren didn't just walk away from the deal. She walked toward something greater. Days after the incident, she redirected the $4 billion into a national initiative supporting minority-owned businesses, underfunded schools, and first-generation entrepreneurs. She called it the Warren Collective, a direct investment in the communities so often overlooked. When asked about it in an interview, she simply said, "They tried to strip me of dignity. I chose to give dignity to others instead. That is power. That is leadership. And that is the legacy that matters." So now, ask yourself, what would you have done in her shoes? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have retaliated? Or would you have done what Celeste did? If you believe that everyone deserves respect, no matter their background, no matter their bank account, take a moment now to drop a comment below. Type the word respect. Let us know where you're watching from. Because stories like this need to be shared. Not to shame, but to remind. Remind us all that the real currency in this world is character. And for those who forget that, there's always a receipt.